Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Aparutade sangamatassa tawaraye sodavanta bemunjantu satang. So listening to the silence, the space that's here and now, it's a way to train yourself to not just sit down in the temple and think about everything else. Your worries about the future and so forth, what to do with your life, and to bring always to this present moment. And of course, the body is like this. There's four postures. They're either sitting, standing, walking, or lying down. And breathing, inhaling, exhaling. Notice that it's like this. It's not, refraining from making it personal. It is the way it is. Because at this moment, things are just like this. That's the way it is. And so we open, embrace the present here and now like it is, whatever you're experiencing, pleasure, pain, happiness, depression, whatever the mood, whatever the physical condition you're experiencing is like this. So you have one more week to entering the vasa, the pansa, this traditional form in which we determined to spend the 3 months in the monastery, except certain allowances. So this is a tradition. That's been carried through time. And during this time, especially like in Thailand, for example, they're dedicated to more serious practice, even though daily life, any time of the day or night, is serious practice. But the 3 months of the vasa gives us a special time, just perceiving it as such. The main duty to break through the illusions of a self, a separate self, all the identities you have acquired in your life through the years, whether they're positive or negative, it doesn't matter. They're acquired perceptions, and they influence how we see ourselves in the world we live in. So what to do with one's life? We ask ourselves, how are we going to live this life? Because it is an opportunity to do what? Just to survive, to procreate the species, survive the trials and tribulations of life till we die of old age, hunt for food, sitting in my kuti, looking out at the garden and outside the window of my kuti, looking at the the birds and the squirrels desperately looking for food. And the squirrels, they don't have a sense of being a personality. They're conscious forms in consciousness, but they don't have a language, about whether their parents loved them or didn't, whether they had good parenting or they didn't, or they were, being male squirrels or female squirrels, and all these distinctions that we create a sense of separateness, uniqueness. And this is what the suffering is about, of the First Noble Truth, is being separate in a vast universe, in a vulnerable form such as a human body. It's lonely. When you see yourself only as some very separate individual person, unique personality, or a special, maybe you see yourself as have a special mission in life, or a special profession to accomplish, or whatever, whether it's special or ordinary, high or low, whether it's royalty or poverty. These are all acquired perceptions. They're not like squirrels don't see themselves in terms of being upper class or lower class. At least as far as I know. So, this whole thing, this class structure, gender identity, even religious identity is an acquired identity. So I emphasize this over and over. What we acquire in life is conditioned. So from birth, I'm born with that sense of a separate self, a conscious form, human form, infant form, and then we acquire this sense of our separateness, our uniqueness, our ordinariness, our superiority or inferiority, our acquired identities that we get through the conditioning process. So in meditation, the whole point is get to the source. Find the source of all this, where, like returning almost to infancy, to that pure state of a pure awareness, pure conscious awareness, that it's not conditioned, it's not cultural, it doesn't have a name or an identity. We give it a name, we call it consciousness or mindfulness. But even then, it's not a word. Like the word consciousness is an interesting word these days because nobody knows what it is. And we're trying to find it, trying to look for it, trying to scientifically prove, is it the brain or is it, so by investigating, through this technique of vipassana insight practices that we inherit in this tradition, is all about getting to the source. Yoniso manasika, get to the very source of being present here and now, consciousness here and now. So when I started this reflection, I was saying the silence, the space is here and now. Maybe your mind isn't silent. Maybe you've got all kinds of thoughts, doubts, worries, personal problems, hopes, expectations, or fears. But if you let go of all that, what remains when you've let go of all these conditions is kind of blissful silence. So when we talk about just the word bliss is a kind of problematic word because we tend to associate the word with the kind of drug addiction where you're blissed out on due to some kind of chemical reactions, where you feel absolutely euphoric and happy and at one with the universe due to various drugs or conditions. But the bliss of silence isn't conditioned. It's here and now. And in this temple, it's this what I really like about this building is that there's a silence that it resonates very clearly, at least for me, inside this temple. But the temple is in the silence, so the temple is not necessary for silence. But when we come into the temple, it's a reminder. We might be caught up with our duties, our responsibilities, our position, our doubts and worries, and then we bring those into the temple, and we sit down and we start worrying about the future, or getting carried away with our feeling of responsibility, duty, our position, what to do with our lives. All this can go on, the mind can keep very busy inside this temple. So learning to use the temple for awareness. So that's why I like to begin these kind of reflections on how to see the stillness, the silence, the space. Not just come in and sit down with all your worries and problems, but to recognize that the temple is a kind of sign, a kind of symbol of that. The Buddha Rupa on the shrine. We can see it in terms of it's a golden image, whether we think it's beautiful or we don't, we think it's overpowering or it's necessary or it's unnecessary. We might have all kinds of opinions and views about Buddha Rupas, Buddha images. But that's not using them for awareness. It's merely being caught up with personal prejudices, biases, preferences that we may not notice. We're caught up with our aesthetic tastes, our refinements, our religious conditioning. And we don't see what we're doing. We just operate from habit, from tradition, from conditioning. So that's why we suffer, because we're not conditioned. Our true nature isn't a condition. If our true nature was conditioned, then there'd be no possibility of ending suffering. If we are just what we think we are, and believe we are, and the world that we believe is the world that we believe in, the material world, the emotional world that we experience, the conditioned world, cultural identities, all these are artificial conditions. Just like the Buddha Rupa is an artificial condition. So when we approach the Buddha Rupa or the temple merely from the conditioned level of personal taste or appreciation or adverse opinions, then we're identifying ourselves with the conditioned realm, and that's not what Buddha Rupas are meant to be. They're not to be about aesthetics or golden images or things like that. They can be used. They're not absolutely necessary. If they're around, there's like this. If they're not around, there's still the silence, the space, the awareness here and now. So on a cultural level, we're conditioned to have our sense of duty, responsibility, our position, what a good woman should be, a good man should be, ideals of perfection in terms of the gender, in terms of government, democracy, equality, freedom, justice, fairness, all these fine words are conditions. How to use them then for awareness rather than just operate from just individual reactions to these words. It's like, how do we can use the Buddha Rupa on the shrine for awareness or just form opinions about it. Or just ignore it. But symbols do have an effect on us because these forms are conditioned. The body that you identify is a condition. It's an empty phenomenon. It's not a real solid person, a special person, a soul or individual that is special in any way other than it is a condition in this realm of conditioned phenomena. So, instead of seeing oneself always from the limitation of mortality, seek your identity with the unconditioned. Make a stand with the unconditioned. And what is that? The silence, the space that's present here and now. So in bhavana, it's really learning to recognize the silence. That's the very background, the substratum of all the changing forms, the emotions we feel, the thoughts, the doubts, the worries, the habit patterns, the identities, social, religious identities. Buddhism itself is a condition. Christianity, Judaism, Islam, they're all conditions, artificial conditions created by human beings. So when we grasp the forms without wisdom, without getting to the source, then we become Buddhists, we become Christians, we become Jews, Muslims, we become something that is separate from something else. So Buddhism is separate from Christianity in terms of the condition. So that we live in this realm of separateness. And that's what suffering is about, being identified always in this lonely, isolated form, that's dependent on food, survival, shelter, clothing. So the form, this is, in this particular Thai forest tradition, the emphasis on the four requisites. The Buddha allowed, these four requisites to be reflected upon again and again. Why is that? Because most of us come from affluent backgrounds. Standard of living at this time worldwide is pretty high. So life here in the UK is the standard that ordinary people are accustomed to. Is a pretty high standard of comfort, luxury, and convenience. And then in the Thai forest tradition, in the early stages of my monastic life in Thailand, it was the shelter was a kuti, wooden hut with a tin roof. The robes were provided, these kind of dun-colored robes, bindabat food, medicine, which is very in Thailand and in Wat Pa Pong at that time, they used a lot of herbal medicines. Ajahn Chah was an expert herbalist, knew all the medicinal properties of the various things that grow in the forests in Thailand. So this is bringing life, the material identities down to kind of a basic survival. And even though, the standard for monasticism is definitely higher than it used to be, the kind of comforts and availabilities, central heating, and we have iPads, iPhones, things like this that but the point is not to say we have to go back to no electricity and to just survival and the four requisites as to be true samanas, to be true mendicants, because that is another identity. Being a real mendicant is another sense of separateness and oftentimes sense of superiority. So what is the answer to these questions? Is it to what do we do with our lives as individual human forms? And of course, the thing that attracted most of us to Buddha Dhamma was it gave us a tool, a convention, a form to use, to reflect upon, not to become the form and to, blindly identify with Buddhism or with the Thai forest tradition or with monasticism, but it's all symbolic, all artificial conditions to how to use these conditions that we're using in this monastery with awareness, with wisdom. So wisdom, what is that? When we use that word, it's a common enough English word. And then so many of you think you're not wise, or believe I'm wise, or Ajahn Amaro is wise, or maybe you correct Rinpoche was wise. But what do we mean by wisdom? What is the real, when we get to the source of reality, of Dhamma. Where does wisdom lie? What is it that is truly wise? And this is available to all of us. It's not about me being wiser than the rest because I've been a monk for so long. That's a construction, isn't it? A mental construction that you create. This whole construction of Ajahn Sumedho is conceptual. In terms of my reality, the form is now getting very old. The physical body. So it's like this. When I identify with the age of the body, then the habit patterns of who wants to be old and what happens when I die. Will I be reborn? I've been a monk 55 years or more, and I've dedicated my life to meditation, to Buddhism. And will I be reborn? Am I a stream enterer or an arahant? Or what am I? Or am I just a vitujana, an ordinary, unenlightened individual? These are questions that we ask ourselves when we identify with the forms. Am I as wise as Luang Por Chah? Or is he wiser than I am, or vice versa? These are all thoughts, perceptions, concepts, objects of the mind. But the silence is here and now, uncreated. It doesn't come and go. As you cultivate awareness, the silence becomes the prominent reality because it's here and now all the time, whatever happening, whatever posture you're in, whatever emotions you're experiencing, whatever it is day and night, or you're healthy or sickly. So learning to realize silence, the space between the thoughts, the space between the words, is silent. When you ask yourself a question, what's the purpose of life? You might come up with some, you say, quote, some philosopher or Buddha or Ajahn Chah, what's the purpose of life? And then you say, Ajahn Sumedho, what is the purpose of life? And I could give you an answer to that, an intellectual answer. And so you grasp that, Ajahn Sumedho told me this, the purpose of life, but you don't really know that. You don't know the purpose of life because somebody else gave you the answer to your question. You can believe what they say, but that's another artificial condition that you're grasping. So getting to the source is awareness, is the gate, the door to the deathless. Amatasa Tawara, the gate to the door to the deathless. Here and now, it's not about cultivating mindfulness as a practice in order to become enlightened anymore, because all that is still conditioned self-references, of duty, having to do something, having to meditate, having to get somewhere in your practice, or you've been practicing some form of meditation for years now and you haven't gotten anywhere, or you've got a level of samadhi, I've reached, I have abundant samadhi, I'm really accomplished. It's still the perception of a separate self that's attained something. And anything you attain, whether you believe it or not, is a condition. This whole sense of attaining, achieving, getting somewhere, becoming enlightened is all conceptual, proliferating concepts. It's what you've heard, the jargon of this tradition. So in the silence, there's no concept. Silence isn't the word silence is a concept, but it's just a concept to remind us of here and now. And as you determine to realize the silence, the substratum of our existence, where existence arises and ceases, then the purpose of life is no longer a problem, no longer a question in the mind. The questions all dissolve into the silence. Because all conditions arise and cease. What do they arise and cease in? Do they just come from thin air, or is it if they arise, they've got to rise from something, and they must cease into something. What's left when the conditioned world is ceased? And we learn this not through grand visions of the universe that we live in suddenly ceasing, according to the idea of cessation. But realize that cessation is going on all the time. The thoughts arise and cease. And if you observe, if you're the puto, the observer of thought, rather than the thinker, then you notice the absence of thought. You don't notice the absence of thought if you're always trying to find it as a concept, trying to find a silence as, some goal to achieve, something to get, to develop, to cultivate, as some kind of personal endeavor. Or seeing through the limitation of personality, Sakya Ditti Silabhata Baramasa. It's all, these first two fetters. And, from personal experience, not being a person is a great relief. To realize all the fears, vanity, selfishness, worries, anxiety habits, depression, jealousy, guilt and remorse, endless psychological conditions arise and cease that we cling to, identify with, or suppress. They're all illusions that we believe in and see in highly personal terms. When you let go of that, when you get to the very source of here and now, the silence, the space, is like this. Trust that. That is insight into what we call the path, or some right understanding. And when we have that understanding, it's an insight knowledge, it's not acquired knowledge, because you can recite, probably all of you can recite the 8 factors of the eight steps of the Eightfold Path in Pali, or translate them into English or French or any other language. So it's not knowing the 8 steps, the 8 factors, 8 steps of enlightenment, of the path, of the Eightfold Path, but in trusting in awareness. A simple, spontaneous reality of here and now that is uncreated, unformed, unconditioned, unborn, that is not personal. It's anatta, not a personal separate self. And this is what we call relief. Suddenly it's suddenly the burden of life, all the difficulties that one creates as a personality, even living in a sangha, personal relationships, seniority, titles, gender problems between monks and nuns, anagarikas, all these identities. We can create endless problems, personal reactions to these identities. So we create the suffering out of this ignorance of avijja, not knowing Dhamma, reality itself. One time I read in a Zen book, Zen describing the experience of nirvana, and they said nirvana is like when you've been carrying this heavy burden on your back for a lifetime and you're really exhausted. You're so tired of this weight, carrying this heavy weight around, that you put it down. And that's nibbana, relief. So not being a person, not feeling attached to any position, it doesn't mean we have to get rid of our tradition or our position in the Sangha. This is convention only. But see it as convention, as just a skillful means, which the true practice isn't about becoming a monk or a nun, but in realizing Dhamma, awakening to reality. So that's why I say, to really observe, be the observer of what you think you are. Listen to your ego. You're not trying to get rid of the ego. It's not something you've got to get rid of or make judgments about. Whether you're conceited or you feel inferior, it doesn't make any difference. These are all conditioned identities. Whether you tend to be arrogant and bossy, or think you know it all, or you're full of doubts and worries, listen to whatever goes on in your mind, because it's conditioned. And your position is Buddho, awakened awareness, knowing. It's like this. and letting it be what it is. So it's not a matter of changing or getting rid of it, but realizing the emptiness of self-conceit, of arrogance, of feelings of superiority, of feelings of worthlessness or inferiority. Whatever your tendencies, personal tendencies might be, it's not about you all have to become humble individuals and practice humility as some ideal, because humility is a beautiful idea. But just trying to be humble as a person can be another form of sakyaditi. You think, you believe you're more humble than somebody else who's very arrogant. And all that is a self-creation, isn't it? A creation of comparing yourself with somebody else, your opinion about somebody else's behavior or attitudes is like this. So whether it's true or false, right or wrong, that's not the issue anymore. It's being the Buddho, the knower of the way it is, that all conditions arise and cease, and in the cessation is peace. So when somebody dies, in Thailand, for example, because most Thais are Buddhists, they call the monks to chant just this simple chant, Anicca vada sankhara ubbatawa yatamino ubachitawa niruchanti de sang ubbasamo sukho. And there's a 2-line chant, just saying all conditions are impermanent, what arises ceases, and in their cessation is peace. So in the simple 2-line phrase that is part of a tradition, Pali tradition, there's real wisdom there. Even though oftentimes you're chanting it just because it's part of a tradition. But then you realize that anicca vada sangha, all conditions are impermanent. And then you got to know conditions, be the unconditioned awareness of conditioned phenomena. This is what Buddho, what Buddha, the word Buddha really means, in a practical way, not in a just traditional form. So in my life as a monk, just seeing the end of suffering and just letting things be what they are. I conform physically to the Vinaya, and physically and verbally, try to anyway. But that's a choice, because I see it as a tool rather than as some kind of personal duty or responsibility. Then the emphasis that Luang Por Chah always made on this Buddho, this mantra, Buddha, it actually is the name of Buddha, which means awakened consciousness, the unconditioned reality of here and now. So when we take refuge in Buddha, this is what, it's not taking refuge in a traditional form, in a word or in a concept or an ideal. It's the practical reality of being aware. Because even the word Buddho is a condition. So it's not grasping the word, but what the word reminds us when we get carried away with our personal conditioning is an opportunity to be aware of it. So when you're caught up in worry or anxiety about the future, or what to do with your life, how should I spend my life? And, or should I become a monk or a nun, or should I? You can get in line without becoming a monk or a nun, or what's the best thing I can do? Listen to. I'm not saying you have to answer these questions, but listen to yourself thinking, the doubting. What should I do with my life? Because those are words. And behind those words is a silence, the eternal silence of here and now. Underlying those words, what should I do with my life? It's a silence that is non-suffering. Silence doesn't suffer. Because it's the unconditioned. So when you take refuge in Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha, and these forms, you're taking refuge in the unconditioned, not the words of the unconditioned, but the reality, which is what you really are. So the problems drop away. As you see their cessation, not that you suppress them or get rid of the problems, you allow problems to arise, you listen, you're aware, and they're like this. You're patient, allowing them to abide and cease, and you're aware of their beginning, their middle, their end. And that which is aware of the beginning, middle, and end is the deathless. So this encouraging on this pansa, this vasa, which will begin next week, you're hearing me, you're a sodawanta, one who's listening, pamunchantu satang, which means trust this. You can't trust what you think because it's always changing. And thinking is dependent upon other conditions. So how can you ever find peace or happiness in something that you can't, that is just uncertain, unstable? We tend to seek permanent happiness, finding the right relationship, the perfect mate, the one that was made for me in heaven by God. That's a romantic notion. But mates, wives or husbands, partners, they're all unstable conditions. They're changing. They have their karmic tendencies and habits that are different from oneself. So how can you expect somebody else to be a permanent form of happiness for you throughout your life? That's kind of a Cinderella story. Living happily ever after is a fairy tale. Because the conditioned realm is this continuous changing, incessant, inexorable change that we're experiencing every moment through these forms. So even when you have this insight into the unborn, uncreated, unformed, unconditioned, the form is still getting old. The weather changes, the time of day or night changes, the seasons change. Your emotions still, habitual patterns of emotional reaction change. But the difference between an aware individual and an unaware individual is the aware individual meditator is aware that all conditions are impermanent, they're not self. And that's a relief. You're not the limited thing that you believe you are. No matter how special you might feel, or how arrogant or conceited you might be as a personality, or how hopelessly screwed up or inferior you feel, all these are to be recognized as conditioned phenomena. They're empty. They're not what one is. So I offer this as a reflection